I've lost track of most of what I've done with bonsai, but I remember the very exact day when I saw my first bonsai. It was April 21st, 1963. And the reason I remember it is I got married on April 20th. My husband was in the New York City Police Academy, and we had off the weekend. So our honeymoon trip was walking down Eastern Parkway where our apartment was, and we went to the Botanic Gardens. And we wandered around and eventually found our way to the bonsai exhibit. And it was spring, and I don't remember any tree that was in the exhibit except for the wisteria. It was on a pedestal, its blossoms hung below the stand. It was love at first sight, and I said to my husband, I'm going to do that someday. Of course, that was a safe thing to say. I lived in an apartment, and I had my 3 African violets growing on a windowsill. Time moves on. We moved to suburbia, a big 40 by 100 lot. I had 3 kids, and I still had an interest in bonsai. So we were wandering one time upstate. We had property upstate, and I saw a sign that said bonsai for sale. So I quick whipped the car in, met a couple that were, let's say, off the grid. They were hippies, and they were selling some trees, and this was bonsai. So I bought one. And of course, that one lingered for a short period of time before I killed it, because I really hadn't a clue how you take care of bonsai. A couple of more years go by, and I see a notice about a bonsai exhibition that was being held in Manhattan. I don't remember which hotel it was. My daughter was probably 5 or 6 years old. She was born in 1970. We took the Long Island Railroad. We went, we saw this bonsai. We got a raffle ticket when you came in for a door prize, and we wandered around, and when it was finally time to call the raffle, my hopes were high. I had my ticket, and it wasn't my number. And they called the number again. Nobody wanted the tree. Nobody answered. They called a second number. That one was mine. Well, you would have thought I won the lottery. Now, I got a shopping bag. I had a 5-year-old in one hand, my shopping bag in the other. We got back on the railroad, went home. Okay, still didn't know anything about bonsai, didn't know clubs existed, and I managed to keep that one alive for maybe 2 months before it finally withered away. It was a juniper. Then, probably 3 years down the road from that, I saw a notice in Newsday about a bonsai meeting that was being held at Farmingdale University, and it was the Greater New York Bonsai Society, which was an early club. I went to the meeting, was in a big lecture hall. I sat upstairs, and I thought, gee, this is really good. They got lots of great information, and I think I'll join. And at that time, their membership consisted of meetings at Farmingdale and meetings at the Queen's Botanic Garden. So you were getting 2 meetings a month for 1 bill. So I thought, that's a great deal, always looking for a bargain. And maybe it was a year later that I saw an ad also talking about the Long Island Bonsai Society, and they were meeting at Clark Garden. That was closer to home, so I went there, and I joined that club also. The kids were a little bigger. My husband didn't work shift work anymore, so it was easy to get out at night. Phil Tactile was still actively doing bonsai. He had a shop in Farmingdale. It was called Jewy-san, and his sister Ann ran the shop. And they carried trees and soil and wire and everything you needed. And that's been one of our biggest problems. It's hard to find locally the stuff that we need. Sorry, over there with the waving. Sorry. So it was hard to find material, but having Jewy-san there, it was great. And we also were lucky that we had some members that brought in trees. Lee Abrams was one of them. We had Rose and Peter Bringer, and a couple of other members periodically would bring in stuff. So we always had a source of material. We're lucky now because we have Dan coming, and he always schleps in a whole bunch of stuff. And when you get started with bonsai, you just really don't know where to start. You don't know what kind of tree that you want. You don't know what the trees need. And that's probably the best way, is to pick 1 or 2 varieties and find out everything you can about what that tree needs in the way of watering, whether it needs a lot of sun, a little sun. Maple trees are great, but their leaves burn in the heat of the summer, and then you won't have pretty foliage come the fall. If you're going to work with tropical material, you have to have a space indoors to keep them over the winter. The good part about the hardy trees is they're exactly the same as their native counterparts that grow outside. What we want to protect them from is the sun and from the wind. So you find a location in your yard or in a garage where they're not exposed to that, because the fluctuation of temperature later in the winter causes the trees to start to come out of dormancy, and then they die off. And so you want to avoid that. I used to keep my trees, I've recently moved up to Putnam County, but before I had, that little 40 by 100, I had a big old yew bush in the back, and I used to put my trees in the ground next to the neighbor's garage on our property. So they were out of the sun, they didn't get a lot of heavy wind and rain from the tree protected them, and I never lost a tree then. I wish I could say the same was true for my move, because now I had to cope with rodents that like to eat the bark, eat the buds off of things, and deer. So I did lose some of my trees, and my absolute favorite tree that I had was a black pine seedling that I poached from the Exxon station around the corner from my house, and it was one little upright stem and one row of little skinny branches. And I planted that little thing into a 2-gallon container, and I just kept waiting for it to tell me what it wanted to be. And I had it for probably 3 years when I decided, okay, you're big enough now, I'm going to do something with you. And I had a piece of metal rod out in the garage. It was probably 20 inches or so long. I put it in the bench vise. I took a hollow galvanized pipe for leverage, and I bent this into a sort of curve. And I said, okay, this tree is going to be a cascade, because that was my favorite type of tree. So I took that poor little tree and I stuck the rod in the ground, and I took wire and I used my famous bicycle inner tubes to protect the bark. Now I've used this for years. This is one bicycle inner tube, so it lasts forever. And it protected the bark from the wire scarring. Now, in the modern times, instead of wire, I probably would have used those plastic zip ties like they use for prisoners and stuff, because they hold great. And you just got to cut them off as you do the wire. So that tree was coming along really, really nicely. And I had high hopes for it. It was starting to bend down. The foliage was great on it. And I had a shelf, 3 shelves by the back stoop. And it consisted of cinder blocks, and I think they were 2 by 12 boards. So I had 3 tiers filled with all kinds of potential bonsai. But my black pine was going to be the star of the crowd, and it was on the end so it could hang down undisturbed. Except I decided it was time to build a fence, because the fence down the property line was falling apart. And I'd squeeze through the gate with my lumber, and I'd look at the tree and I said, you really should move that before you knock it down. But why would you listen to your good brains, So, P.S., I did knock it off the shelf. And I said all kinds of bad words that my mother forbade me from using, and I broke the apex. Now I was really pissed, plain English. But that was what we call an accidental restyle. The rest of the tree was fine. It just didn't have a top anymore. So I said, okay, we're going to make a new apex. And a couple of years went on, and it was starting to look really good again. And I said, okay, there's hope for this tree. It finally took the rod off. It kept its shape. I was looking for the perfect pot to keep my tree in. And I moved to Putnam County. And unfortunately, in the winter of 2014, I lost my tree. And I practically wanted to cry. It was like my baby. It was like a pet. The other trees, you care when they die or I screw up. But that one really hurt. But being an optimist that I am, I'm hopeful that there will be a tree in there in my lifetime. Of course, I got to hurry up. Maybe Dan's got something that's going to work for me. Getting involved in bonsai, it's got lots of parts. Your family's never going to have to ask, what would you like for your birthday? You don't get another shirt and a tie or a sweater, because you've got all this junk that you could use. This is drywall tape. It makes great, it's self-sticking. You put it on the inside of the pot to close the hole rather than use the wire that we used to use like this. There's plastic canvas that they use, that they do needlepoint. You can get it in the different craft stores. There are a lot of innovative things that are used for bonsai now that weren't used 20 and 30 years ago. Plus, 20 and 30 years ago, we had rules. The tree had to be a certain thickness in relation to the height. The first branch had to be a third of the way up off the ground. It had to be offset from the center of the pot. When you heard all of this stuff, you wanted to run screaming because you said, I'll never remember this stuff. Now we're like all over the board. You know, the younger artists have all become very innovative. The trees look different. They're a fascinating hobby. This is white plumber's tape that you wrap around the threads on a pipe. It holds very well on the bonsai. This is black waterproof tape that plumbers also use. It makes a great, if you're grafting something or you crack a branch, some branches forgive you when you crack them, unlike my tree. And you wrap this tape because it's sticky and it stretches and it really holds tight on the tree, and the branch will and can heal itself. So we have those kind of things. We used to use window screening on the bottom of these pots and stuff, and that's to keep the soil from washing out. This is what you use when you put a window in. It's like an insulator. You can cut a piece of this and use this to protect the bark rather than it in a tube. This is pipe insulation that keeps your pipes from dripping, makes great insulation. You just cut off a piece and you wrap the wire around, and you don't mar the bark on your tree, because those wire marks don't go away readily. So you really want to be careful about doing that to the tree. Now, when we pot up a tree, everybody's got their own soil recommendations. Some will use akadama, some use kanuma. They're imported from Japan. They're expensive. Kanuma is for azaleas. Hal has great results using peat moss and pool filter sand. Jim has his own recipe. Some of us order material from outside vendors. It's expensive because of shipping, but we always tend to sift our soil. This is one, even though it looks still brand new, I do use it all the time. It was one of the first toys I bought myself. And the screen has different sizes, and depending on which size you put in when you sift your soil, the fines that you don't want fall through and you use what's on top. Sometimes I use two screens together. But when you use bonsai soil or any soil for your trees, beside anchoring the tree into a pot, it's supposed to retain some moisture, and it's supposed to provide some air pockets which the roots need in order for the trees to grow. So we don't want to use garden soil, which gets as hard as a rock. And trees have to be repotted, usually depending on the age of the tree, sometimes, and the variety. Sometimes it's once a year, sometimes it's every 2 years. On a mature tree, it might be 5 years. But eventually, whatever material you use breaks down, and you'll notice that the water doesn't go through as quick as it used to. It could be that the soil is now hard as a rock. It could be the soil dried out, or it could be that the pot is full of roots. And when we repot, we take it out, we trim back some of the roots because you want new, fresh roots to help the tree grow to get its nutrients. All trees need to be fed, and all they really want is nitrogen, phosphate, and potash. The NPK, the 3 numbers you see on fertilizer. The plant doesn't care whether it comes from an organic source, it comes from Peters, it comes from Miracle-Gro. It just knows that's what I need to eat. And there are some trace elements that we throw in. And this is orchid food. My trees don't read, they don't care. They just want to know what the numbers are. This tells me it's bloom proof, plus rather, I'm sorry. And again, the numbers are 10, 60, and 10. So the plant's only getting more of the middle number. And depending on the season and the state of growth it is, you feed it different things. As fall is approaching, even though we're in the middle of August and it doesn't seem like fall's coming, it is. We start giving our trees less food now to harden off the growth. We don't want them to put out new growth now because it will die off in the winter. So we give it less of the first number and more of the next 2 numbers. Then again, because Bonsai has all of these wonderful tools that you can get, and I have almost all of them, I think, except a die grinder. But I have a saw, which is handy for the small branches that you might want to remove. I don't do big trees just because I don't, and now that I'm getting old, I'm glad I don't. But I also have something I just bought 2 weeks ago. I was with my granddaughters in the Pennsylvania Dutch area where they live. We were in a flea market and they sold these little tweezers for $2. They'd probably be $15 in the Bonsai store, but you can reach in and remove the needles and stuff that you have to pull out with branches. I have a set of files. I have all kinds of dental picks. I use them all. I'm a very bad person. I have all of these toys. Then I have rooting hormone, which comes in different strains, because as a female, and I hope I'm not insulting any of the women here, we really hate to cut off stuff off our trees. And then when we cut them off, we want to root them, see? And then we have all of these little things that will never amount to anything, but we're happy because we didn't throw them out. Now, when you cut them off, you want to seal the cuts with cut paste. And you just wet your finger and you roll it on the top, and it keeps the tree from drying out till it has a chance to heal over. And when you repot, I didn't know this until probably maybe 10 or 15 years ago. There's a thing called mycorrhiza that lives in the soil, and it looks sort of like white strings. And I used to see it when I'd rummage around in the leaf litter on property that we had upstate. And it's a fungus that forms a symbiotic relationship with a plant. And each plant, for the most part, has a different mycorrhiza. The mycorrhiza helps the plant take up nutrients and water, and in exchange, it gives it sugars, it gives it carbohydrates back, so the two of them are happy. When a tree gets repotted, some artists keep some of the old soil because it's got the mycorrhiza in it, or they sell mycorrhiza inoculants, and you can add that to your soil, and it'll start to develop in the new soil that you put down. So again, you can have loads of stuff. When you're styling a tree, wedges help. I'm a would-be carpenter. I still have my fingers, so I'm lucky. But I cut some wedges. I have some narrower ones, but it allows you to change the angle on your tree so you can see which way it might look better.